Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. If you are looking for vendor process training for you or your entire vendor team, head over to my site at deborahrrichardson.com and click on the Vendor Team Training Solved button to learn more about what is included in the monthly or annual plan and also to download a 2021 training schedule. Get the training that you and your team needs to avoid payment fraud, duplicate vendors, compliance fines, and more. Do you know what the top 3 fraud risks are for accounts payable and vendor teams going into 2021? Well, join my guest, Geoffrey Simpson and I, as we talk about our top 3 fraud risks from episode 60 last year and how they were affected by the pandemic, and then hear this year's top 3 fraud risks and how you can combat them. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 117. The top 3 fraud risks accounts payable teams need to watch out for in 2021. Welcome, Geoffrey Simpson. And actually, Geoffrey is coming back for a second time. Last year, this time, he came on the podcast to talk about the top fraud risks going into 2020. And now he's back to talk about the fraud risk going into 2021. So welcome, Geoffrey.
Thank you, and it's great to be back.
All right. So for those that did not listen to your original episode, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I've been in the entrepreneur space for a while, but I decided to go back to school to get my PhD in computer science. And so my research focus has been on cybersecurity and business email compromise and things like domain doppelganger attacks and fun things like that. And so I have an MBA, and so I do have some managerial and accounting background. So I bring a nice combination of business and technical when I talk to people and in my business dealings.
Great. So this should be a good conversation today, talking about. Actually, we're going to review first, like the top 3 fraud risks that we talked about going into 2020 that we needed to watch out for, and just see if the pandemic, because we no one had a barometer on that thing coming up.
Right. Things went a little differently than what we expected.
Yes, it did.
Yes.
So we'll see if the predictions are predictions, if the pandemic made it better or worse, and then we'll look at moving into 2021, what those new fraud risks, if they are new, what they are for accounts payable vendor teams. All right, so let's first review again the last year's top 3 fraud risk AP teams needed to watch out for in 2020 and whether the pandemic made these better or worse. So the first one that we talked about was email scams, which includes phishing and business email compromise, or BEC. So can you just give a short explanation of what that is?
Sure. The easiest explanation is people send emails with some links that they try to get you to click on. And they may, go to websites that look like your bank or look like your email account or your PayPal account. But yeah, they're just trying to trick you into doing something that you wouldn't do if you knew the consequences.
Yeah, and so with that, I think we already know the answer of did
Mm,
the pandemic make this worse or better? But and I know that I've seen some studies that talk about business email compromise and how the incident average per incident average went up. I think it started off at like 53,000 and now
mm,
it's like 80K. And I know you've
mhm.
seen some reports on that as well.
Absolutely, and one of the groups I'm had a couple of papers recently at their e-crime symposium a couple months ago, but the Anti-Phishing Working Group, which is an organization that measures, the evolution and proliferation and propagation of identity theft methods like business email compromise, they have certainly seen a drastic increase over the past year, and not surprising based on what has happened when we've become a more socially distant society, we've become a more technology integrated society. And so that meant over the past year that we have actually increased our use of electronic communication more than we are expecting to based on the situation. And so along with that increase, and I don't want to give away our 2021 numbers, but along with that increase in electronic communication, we certainly saw the large increase in phishing attacks and business email compromise attacks over 2020. So, and,
Yeah,
and that
so
trend is not slowing down.
not slowing down. So the answer to the question of did the pandemic make it worse or better, I think
Mm,
we could say it made the email scams, phishing, BEC worse.
absolutely. So we get a star for that one.
You get a star for that one. Okay, so moving on, the second one that we had from moving into 2020 or that we had to watch out for in 2020 was passwords and shared logins. So you want to
Mm.
give a short explanation of that?
Sure, one-time use passwords are just not a good idea with people being able to, you know, potentially steal or authenticate with just a password means that there are security holes and avenues that attackers could, get into your systems. And so anytime you had a single password, maybe somebody wrote it down, it was compromised, or if it's single compromised at all, not a good idea. And so, last year we talked about password um, applications that helped you like LastPass and things like that that would keep
Mhm.
your passwords under authentication. And that's certainly more and more important over the past year and going forward is storing those securely. And of course, multi-factor authentication is becoming more prevalent and it needs to become more prevalent. We've done a great job based on, our work over the past year. And a large part of that is due to the fact that we were forced into that situation of having to work more distant. And in a lot of ways, it could be a good thing because it did allow a lot of companies to give them a chance to put in some policies and procedures around security and passwords and shared logins that they may not have had that opportunity or willingness to do before. And so now when you had your employees in disparate locations and they needed to log into the same systems, now those shared passwords are becoming more vulnerable, and a system like the sharing logins and things is, yeah, you see those security holes. And we've seen that with recent news reports too, with the SolarWinds issue, when
Yeah.
they had, a single login to their development machine, and that may not have been the hole that the hackers got into, but even companies whose job is to create security monitoring software, they have work to do.
Yeah. So, and I wish that I, was getting some type of affiliate revenue because I'm sure they saw their membership spike or subscription
Mm,
spike. But I have LastPass, and I
mhm,
quite frankly don't even know what my passwords are because, all you have to do is sign up for LastPass. They'll remember it, and
mhm.
they'll autofill it for you, or you could even copy and paste it. I mean, it's a great service. And I also have someone on my team that works on some accounts that I have for marketing purposes, and I don't have to give them the password. I just share it with them, and they don't even know what it is.
Right.
So I do love that part. Also, I know, and as much as we all talk about and have talked about it for years, there were still those people that kept their passwords, under the keyboards. So I guess with everyone moving home, it helped in that regard, right? So,
Hmm.
just someone can't randomly come up and get your password. But overall, did the pandemic, do you think, made the password and shared logins, did it make it better or worse?
Well, we certainly got more news coverage about these security lapses when we're dealing
Yeah,
with the single passwords, and part of that is because the problem did become worse. And we'll talk about it a little bit later on, but because people are in different situations, meaning maybe they're at home instead of the office, different security measures may be needed, and they weren't in place, and that makes it vulnerable to, stealing passwords when you're not in that right, in those
yeah.
right processes and procedures. So when you change things, things get lost or get, slip through the cracks sometimes. So we did see incidences of password issue, yeah, increase this past year.
Okay, so another one for the pandemic making it worse.
Yeah.
Okay, so the third one that we said we needed to, our AP teams needed to watch out for in 2020 was USB drives, where they were right arriving in the mail rooms or finding in the parking lot. So just a quick explanation on what you saw back then.
Sure. Sometimes, we call these, data drops or just hacking drops to where people would just randomly scatter USB drives around a company's parking lot who they are trying to infiltrate. And people would pick up those USB drives almost with 100%, chance that they would pick those up. And then they would go and put these USB drives into their work computers. And that means in cases like the Iran nuclear facility where they are using the centrifuges, this is how the hackers were able to pass that air gap. And that's the term whenever a network is separated from the internet. So there's an air gap between that network and the internet. That's how hackers were able to bridge that air gap as people plugging them into their work computers and transferring malware and Trojan software onto these computers that were not connected to the internet. So we're not going to end up 3 for 3 this time from last year because the incidences of these USB drops actually declined because nobody was, going to work, or we had a drastic decrease in that. And so we've also seen companies increase their security around flash drives in the past year because of the high success rate these hackers have had, and it has become one of the more talked about issues in corporations, because they were so successful and it worked so well.
Well, I will find this as some good news because this one, the pandemic actually made it better because, right, you got the
Hmm.
empty parking lot, so nobody's picking up those USB drives.
That's
And
right.
thank you. I have added a new word to my, fraud, cybersecurity vocabulary: air gap.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, just to kind of recap, did the pandemic make our predictions last year worse or better? Email scams, phishing, BEC made it worse. Passwords and shared logins made it worse. But the USB drives, the pandemic made that better. There was a decrease. So, moving into 2021, which I am sure everyone is so ready to do both on a personal and a professional level. I, for one, am going to be the first one in line for that vaccine as soon as it is available.
Mm.
I'm going on like day 10,743 of being in the house. At least it seems that way. So I'm going to be the first in line.
I'll be right behind you too. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the top three fraud risks
Mm.
accounts payable teams need to watch out for in 2021. And I think the first one is no surprise. It is back up there, the email scams, phishing, and BEC.
Just yeah, absolutely. Just like we just talked about, the numbers have not gone down and they're continuing to increase. And in 2021, we have, over the past few years, we've seen some changes in the way they're doing some of their business email compromise attacks. One of the ways, and this is actually an area of research that I am actively working on, is domain name spoofing. And some of the ways that hackers will try to trick you into clicking on the links is when you have a domain name, and there's a company local to Tulsa called Williams, and I'll use them as an example because they're a good example. Uh, Spelling Williams is WILLIAMS.com. And
Right.
so what the hackers will do is they will look at the name, and this is one type of attack, and they will do a uh, visual fraud. And so we call this a visual identification domain name fraud. So they will replace a W with a VV. So now when you look at it, maybe your font is a little small and maybe it's a little, scrunched up in the email, or you're just not paying that close of attention. But when you glance at that URL, even though it's a VVILLIAMS.com, it looks visually similar to Williams, and maybe you don't give it a second thought. Maybe you click on that. And so that's one type of domain name spoofing. Another type is what we call a third level domain name doppelganger attack. And I know that's a long name for what I'm going to say. But for example, we'll go back to our Williams example. Maybe their website is www.williams.com. We've seen incidences of attackers registering their domain name www-williams.com. So they are using this third level domain name, which is that little section before that first period. So sometimes it's www dot something, maybe it's mail dot something, but we've
Yeah.
seen those domain names like that. But they are combining those third level domain names with their main domain name and then registering a domain name and using that in their business email compromise attacks. So those type of domain name spoofs we think are on the rise. One of the bad statistics that came out of 2020, something that we definitely have to look forward to in 2021, is the increase in the use of SSL certificates in malicious websites. So in the past, we've been able to train people whenever they visit a website to look for the little padlock icon in the address bar.
I know
Well,
that's
yeah.
what I used to look for.
And we have seen, based on the recent statistics from the anti-phishing working group, uh, over 80% of malicious sites or phishing sites have the SSL certificate. So we can no longer rely on that component on teaching people how to determine whether a site is malicious or legitimate. And so that's a big thing, because really going forward, that was one of the things we were able to teach people to look for, and we cannot rely on that anymore.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and that's too bad. So, it really sounds like, unless you're getting an email from a trusted, well, I can't even say that, uh, a trusted partner or internal, because they're finding ways to trick you if you're not looking fast enough. And I know folks in accounts payable, they've got, especially this time of year, they got many emails, a quota, and they're moving at a fast rate. So trying to find these, and I know there are some tools out there that can help
Hmm.
you if you copy and paste the domain, or the email address or domain in there. It can tell you, if how long it's been up, and that's like an indicator of whether it's a fraudulent site or not. But you don't really have a lot of time. You can't do that with every single email because it's
Hmm.
just time consuming. I mean, I guess you can, but what do you see some companies doing to secure, or just move communications out of email altogether, so accounts payable folks don't have to deal with that?
Sure. So one of the main things that is the downfall of email, even though it's been around for so long, is that there's no authentication or
Yeah.
authorization for email communications, and so it is easy to spoof emails, which means send an email from a different address than from the one you're sending, than the one you actually have, and so over time we have looked at ways one of the solutions is to use encrypted email. And so there are platforms and applications. One of the oldest is PGP, which is pretty good encryption that's been around for years, that allows you to encrypt your email, provide a secure signature, so people can then go verify the contents of the email that you're sending. That's important because we have seen, and I really don't want to scare people here, but just letting them know, but there has been some what we call man-in-the-middle attacks against email hosting servers. And what happens is the hackers are able to get into the email server itself. And so let's say you have an Outlook server at your company. They can actually get into these email servers and intercept emails in between sendings. And so if you as an AP person are communicating with a vendor and are communicating, so maybe wire transfer account numbers and things like that, those may not be secure. And we have seen incidences of fraud being committed by these hackers that are on these email servers. And so using these, secure emails, encrypted emails, there's some services that provide that is a way to actually like verify the contents of the email has not been intercepted. One of the other trends that we're seeing, and I know they made the news yesterday, is that we're filming this is the 5th, but on the 4th, Slack, which is an electronic communications. It's kind of like instant messaging for your company. But I use it, and I work with companies that use it, but it's a different electronic communication platform. And so when you have something like Slack that does require people to create an account, and those accounts are verified by the administrator, the electronic communication that are on those platforms like Slack and Microsoft Teams offers something like this. They can be encrypted end to end, and they can be, you can trust that the person you're talking to, when everything's set up right with multi-factor authentication logins and all the above, you can feel secure that the communication you're receiving there is correct communication. And so we are seeing an increase in alternative electronic communications and emails. So there's still not a standardized way for companies to communicate with vendors securely. I mean, different companies have different methods, but that is a trend to watch in the upcoming year.
So that sounds like, with the encrypted emails
Mhm.
and, providing or changing the means of communication via Slack or Microsoft Teams, where you can invite, external parties to your, Slack channel or
Mhm.
to your Microsoft Teams conversation. So that sounds like both of those are more on that at the company level. Maybe IT teams
Yeah.
would handle that. I know they have, widespread is the external email indicator, but that still won't help if you're,
Mhm.
expecting an external email anyway, and you get the spoof name, the VV instead of the
Mhm.
W and Williams. So we still need to make sure that we train the team members, right, not how to not click on those links in
Mm.
emails. And then one of the things that I talk about is authentication, to make sure that you're authenticating so you know who you're talking to. And I'll put a link to a webinar that I did on that for more information. But another thing that I talk about a lot too is really moving the communication again out of email, but this is something that's within the control of the accounts payable team
Mhm.
members.
Mhm.
Is if you have some type of a third party tool that accounts payable teams are already using, maybe for delivering or receiving invoicing from your vendors, as long as they have or that tool has a messaging capability and or a document upload feature, that can be used to get that communication out of email, to
Mm.
get that, what could be a sensitive document like a W-9 that could have a social security number on it, or banking information, and we know that's sensitive, getting all that out of email, maybe using a third party tool. So, between companies, the efforts that companies can take, and then the process efforts that accounts payable can take, we can look at, just moving more out of email.
Yeah, and if you have those trusted lines of communications already established for something else, then by all means, go ahead and use those because they are trusted communications. Absolutely.
All right, so that was the first one. Email scams, phishing, and BEC carried over. Still same problem
Mhm.
for 20 from 2020 going into 2021.
Yeah, and one
Uh,
thing that I didn't
mhm,
mention that I think is important to mention still
yeah,
is we did see, and we talked about the visual identification of the domain names,
yeah.
changing the names, and we've talked about the third level domain names. We're seeing kind of a combination, but they're using some of the common webmail and like team collaboration tools as a target for those type of attacks. And so now, if your company say uses SharePoint and your SharePoint.williams.com, so now we're seeing companies you register, or hackers register SharePoint-Williams.com, which kind of combines that alternative communication platform. So companies that are moving to more SaaS, which is software as a service, which is generally the applications that are hosted in a website. So they're combining all these things that you use to try and trick you. And so the hackers are keeping up to date on Zoom calls or SharePoint sites and webmail. So they're using all these sites that you're used to seeing on a day-by-day basis. They're using those in the way they target these attacks. And so you just have to kind of keep on your toes and watch out for everything.
Yeah, and I think I had a couple of, because I always add to my website like the new scam alerts, and
Hmm.
I know I've seen SharePoint.
Hmm.
I know that I've seen, webmail with Office 365. I know that I've seen a gazillion Zoom ones.
Well,
So
and this
yeah.
is, yeah, and it made it into the news, and not going
Hmm.
to make this political at all, but the company called Burisma that was involved in some of the dealings with Hunter Biden,
Yeah.
the way that, and so they're famous for the hackers were able to get into that company's network and steal information. The way the hackers got into Burisma was through a subsidiary, Cub Energy. Cub Energy had a SharePoint site, which was cubenergy-my.sharepoint.com, and Microsoft sets up these sites whenever you have them host the SharePoint
Okay.
site. The hackers registered cubenergy-my-sharepoint.com. So that is the way the hackers were able to get into Burisma, which was fairly famous hacking case that made it into the news, was being able to target a business email compromise, a phishing email with that website. So that's how they were able to get into Burisma. Was
So
this
does
domain name?
that mean that they were successful in getting an employee to click on the link and actually put
Yes.
their login credentials in?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So the website looked valid because it had
Yeah.
SharePoint, and it had Cub Energy in there, and yep, they thought it was a good site, and it wasn't.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. 2021,
yeah.
you're on. All right. So number two, so the second fraud risk, and this one wasn't on last year, and it's kind of a direct result of the moving of COVID and moving, all of that work to home, and that's internal or occupational fraud. And the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, that organization or association published a December 2020 report called Fraud in the Wake of COVID-19. And they reported a 13% significant increase and a 35% slight increase in employee embezzlement observed as of November 2020. And then an article in law.com entitled Employee Embezzlement in the Times of COVID-19 reported that between April and September 2020, the U.S. unemployment ranged from 7.9% to 14.7%, which that means it really triggered a financial stress right on a large portion of the population. And that financial stress or pressure is one of the fraud triangle's three elements, along with opportunity and rationalization. And what I see as part of what I've seen as part of the issue is that it created, additional segregation of duties issues because maybe everyone wasn't able to work from home, especially not right away, because, people abruptly left the office and went home, in addition to that, the compensating controls, the old anomalies that could be relied on, like the time of day that something was entered or a record was updated, really couldn't be counted on anymore because you've got people that are, and still are, homeschooling kids or just trying to balance the kids' schoolwork, the work that you're doing for your job, along with, your spouse or significant other is doing the same thing, all in the same household. So those compensating controls either, weren't being done or you had to adjust them based on the new work day. And also I saw or heard about quite a few check signers, the USB and the check printers, along with that Micker ink, were going into employees' homes. So that was just a big one. People had to find a way, and we in AP, we find a way to get things done.
That's
so
right.
if whether you're bringing that check printer home so you can print checks, or designating an accounts payable team member as essential to go in and do a check run once a week, or some even postpone to once a month to try to move folks to their vendors to ACH that in the past did not want to move to ACH. But yeah, that was the remote. The abrupt move to work from home really caused some financial stress and created the opportunity for internal and occupational fraud.
Well, we really lost some of the physical security that we took for granted inside of a workplace, even inside of an AP area. So if you have a check printer that somebody is in an office area, in an AP area, and you have several employees that are there throughout the day, and you can generally rely on somebody being there while the doors are unlocked, you take that physical security of that check printer or the signatures for granted. So when you end up in a situation, maybe you do have an AP employee that's deemed essential and they go visit the office once a week to print the checks. What about the physical security of that check printer for the rest of the week while that AP person is not in the office? Is that secured properly inside the office when you don't have those people sitting around that check printer all day long? And the reverse is true as well. If you do have the case where they did take the ink home or the USB drive that contains the signatures, the signature images for these check printers, now you're dealing with having these highly sensitive information or highly sensitive ink and data inside of an employee's home. What type of physical security needs to go into protecting those devices at home? Will will my kid pick up the flash drive when he when he wants to do something, transfer a file, share a file with his brother? What, is that a case? Absolutely, it's a case to where I could be distracted. I know I've put off some work, working from home by washing dishes or putting a load of laundry up or something. My physical security here at home is different from my physical security at the office, and it's, it has some weaknesses that we just need to address with, proper procedures, um, and how to deal with things.
Yeah, and as you know, worldwide, we're going into a second, third phase
Mm.
of, the COVID infection rate, and so it's not going anywhere. We're all going to be home for a while now,
Hmm.
and so these types of things will continue to be there, and as a result of that, the internal and occupational fraud will continue to increase or
Hmm.
at least be more significant than it was in past years. And
Hmm.
so to combat, I, we really need to do the same things that we were doing in the office, although adjusting those for the new normal, as a lot of folks are calling it,
Hmm.
right? Reviewing those management reports. Now, a lot of times that was being done checking against the physical documents because
Hmm.
that's what people had in the office. Now you just need to make sure that those documents are being attached to like the vendor record or to in the accounting system or ERP. So yes, you can still review the management reports, but
Hmm.
instead of viewing you know, the physical documents, now you need to record or attach and then review the electronic versions of
Right.
that. Yeah, and same thing, implementing. I talk about a vendor process audit. A lot of audits are done at the higher level and don't necessarily get into the vendor ads and changes. And that's something that I've always talked about needs to be implemented. But now I think it's even more important to make sure you track those changes on your vendor record,
Hmm.
in addition to checking those that were those vendors that were added. And then, as always, checking that payroll address, bank info for your employees against vendor records. And then just to continue the compensating controls, again, adjusting those based on, the remote work.
Hmm. Yeah, those are all great. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the second fraud risk,
Hmm.
internal occupational fraud. And then the third one, so I've seen, I didn't hear about this word until a couple years ago. It's vishing with a
Hmm.
V. And I got asked on one of the social media platforms last week what the heck vishing was. And vishing is phishing via phone.
Yeah. And so, the phone has been one of the famous hacking tools for many, many years from the very beginning. Some of the first hackers that were called hackers were actually hacking the phone systems. And in one case, the famous hacking story is that they were able to use a whistle out of a cereal. The Captain Crunch cereal, so the little toys they put in cereal boxes. This whistle happened to be at the frequency of 2600 megahertz, which happened to be the frequency that you played into the phone to bypass some long distance charges back when we still had like payphones and things like that. And so these hackers figured out they could use this whistle to bypass paying for long distance phone calls on the phone network. And so phones have been the center of hacking for a long, long time, and it still continues. And phishing via phone is unfortunately on the rise because of the situation, because we no longer, or we may not be in the office to use the office phones where you have the good caller ID, you can verify phone numbers. Now
Yeah.
we're all on our cell phones, and now we're trying to do business over these numbers that maybe we haven't used before. Maybe the company says, well, we're not going to try and forward everybody's office phone to your house phone, and most people don't. I don't have a house phone anymore, but so now everybody's using cell phones and phone numbers that we're not familiar with. And so when you get a call that says, "Hey, this is Joe in IT, I need to know your password because we need to log into the system to reboot it," or for whatever reason. Now we're seeing opportunity because we have a lot more people working remote and phone numbers that are not familiar to us anymore. So there's a huge opportunity with the remote working. And so an old form of hacking is coming back. And another one more famous hackers, Kevin Mitnick, did some human engineering, which is sometimes what this is referred to, when you're calling somebody and trying to get information from them, which is just another form. We can call that phishing. We can call it human engineering. But it's really trying to get information out of somebody without them knowing the consequences again.
So, okay, I may be 20, 25, I don't know, 30 years too late. But wait a minute, the whistle from the Captain Crunch cereal
Yes,
box
absolutely. And
could have
so
saved
that
me all that money on long distance?
absolutely, yeah. And so they obviously fixed that over the years, but and that 2600 megahertz is actually a fairly famous word in the hacking community. And so there's a magazine called 2600 that is
Mhm.
named that because of that frequency of that Captain Crunch whistle. And so the fun part in hacking was originally just finding ways to do things and
Right.
not with malicious intentions. And so some of the community is not happy that hacking has a negative connotivity to it. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's a long history of hacking and using phones to get people to give you information because you don't necessarily have. This is where we go back to the authentication component of it. When you're talking on the phone, you don't necessarily have that authentication that that other person is who they say they are, or that they have the authority that they say they have. And we didn't really put it on the list to talk about, but there are spoofing of voice calls. And so there is the technology out there that somebody can use software to alter your voice to sound like somebody else.
Yes.
And also on top of that, the technology is coming into age to where they can do that with video as well. And
So
so
is that
I'm
what is that deep fakes?
yes, the deep fakes, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. And so even though I see you on the video, I'm not necessarily convinced it's you.
So
I'm just
wasn't
kidding.
there Yeah, but wasn't there one last week, or the week of Christmas or the week of New Year's with Queen Elizabeth, and she
Yes.
was doing some cartwheels or something?
hmm Yes, absolutely. And so we're seeing, it's the same technology that television like The Mandalorian uses when they, with a spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen, yeah, The Mandalorian, just, mute it for a couple seconds. But when they brought Luke Skywalker back in that last episode, it was
Yeah.
not the actor, it was the deep fake type of technology that these movie studios and visual effects use to map somebody's face onto another actor. And so that technology is available to consumers today. And it does take some skill and talent right now, but there
Yeah.
will be tools created that make it even easier. There's probably going to be an Instagram filter that makes you look like whoever you want to be or sound like whoever you want to be, because it will be that easy within the next few years.
And going back to, your point with, the human engineering, and it's old, but it's new again. Voice is the oldest form of communication. You can evoke that emotion, and, that social engineering is just so prevalent when you're talking about the phone. So you mentioned authentication, and that's
hmm
something that I prescribe to. When you're on the phone, when you call your bank is going to authenticate you before they start talking to you about whatever it is
hmm
your inquiry was.
Well,
And
and
so,
you authenticated them from your side by calling a known number. So you know that
yes,
number that you're calling is their number too.
Yes, and to that point, you mentioned earlier too, and we definitely saw this in accounts payable, between the accounts payable teams and the vendors, is that, moving remote and moving to outside of your workspace, and trying to work, you don't have, you can call the number, their office number that's on the vendor record, and they're not going to pick up, for a lot of accounts payable processes for especially banking changes is to make that confirmation phone call. Well, what happens when you try to make that confirmation phone call and you don't get through because the vendors have done the same thing we did. They're all at home now using their cell phones.
Right. Well, and that's where that trusted line of communication, if you have that, and you have what we call the shared secret. So if there's a token you can generate, sometimes they're the one-time use codes that you get over text messages, but if you have a shared way of communicating, whether that's through a vendor portal or through a Slack channel, and you have a shared token, you can say, oh, let me read off the token, let me validate it, or let me read the first few letters, and you read the second set of letters. So there's that authentication method that's important to use. Some companies use things like that. So
yeah, and I'm all for that. Finding a way to eliminate those phone calls where possible. Get the phone calls and the emails. Just get rid of those, and find another way to authenticate, or either through the login process for like a vendor portal, or an invoicing tool. Again, if it has that messaging and/or upload capability, just eliminate that phone call altogether, especially if someone in accounts payable receives a phone call from someone. You can't necessarily validate who that's from because they can spoof the phone number too. So it's imperative that you authenticate, or just find a way to eliminate that phone call.
Yeah.
All right, so those are our three top fraud risks to watch out for accounts payable teams in 2021. Of course, there was the email scams with phishing and BEC, or business email compromise. It was the internal or occupational fraud. And then lastly, the vishing, which is the phishing via phone. So Geoffrey, what are some, just some overall ways? I know we talked within each one of them about, how they can combat those fraud risks, but overall, what are just some overall ways to avoid fraud?
Sure. I know the IT departments everywhere are doing what they can to try and filter out a lot of the business email compromise attempts and phishing attempts. They're doing everything they can. But as part of that, they do have a responsibility to provide some training to every employee on what's the proper way to use the software that they've been given, the email, what are the proper procedures. If there's a link in an email, when is it okay for me to click? Some companies may have a policy that you're not allowed to click any links in an email, but that should be part of an onboard process for new employees. And it's also keeping existing employees up to date on any procedures and policies that have changed. And we could probably all use a refresh on our rules, since the phishing and BEC kind of changes and adapts all the time. I know lots of companies do continual testing and continual training with employees. They'll send out the emails with some links in there as training for the employees. And one of them recently made the news. I forget what company it was, but they created a phishing email to send their employees telling them that they had gotten a Christmas bonus. Yes.
GoDaddy. It was GoDaddy.
It was GoDaddy, yeah. And then it actually was a test for their employees about clicking on phishing links. And so
they got a test, all right.
they certainly did a test. So then maybe there's better ways to do the testing and training of employees. That probably wasn't the best one to do. But training really goes back to teaching employees and working with the employees. It's not a you versus us thing. We're not against the IT department. We're all trying to work together to make sure that there's no fraud. We don't want to lose money as a company because that hurts the bottom line, that hurts everybody. We don't want that. So we're all working together to the same goal. And yeah, we're just doing what we can, each department, And so, the training, and we've seen this, we talked about it a little bit more, maybe physical security has changed based on the working conditions. And so, as part of fraud prevention is physical security as well. We talked about, the flash drives maybe with the signatures, but it goes back into now we have laptops, and maybe before you kept your laptop at your desk and you did not take it home, you didn't travel with it. Well, now you have your laptop at home. What happens? Some companies may not want you to have your laptop on your home network without being connected through a VPN because they can't control the other devices on the network. And so it's another way of another opportunity to train employees on physical security. And of course, that leads back to internet security, just general training as well. How do you use the internet? Some companies have set some good examples, or at least one of the ways some companies handle, personal browsing at work is that, we have two different networks. We have the work network, which is on your work computer, and then we have set up a personal network for your personal devices, for your phone, for your personal laptop. If you want to bring it, you're free to browse the web as much as you want on your personal devices, as long as you do your work. But we're going to separate the networks because that reduces the attack surface, and so that makes the corporate network safer. So there's lots of options, but lots of opportunities for training, and it, from the ground up.
And that physical security, I knew a couple of incidents, and I'm sure there are more all over, where a lot of accounts payable teams were using desktops, and so that abrupt move to home required that they now get laptops, and so that physical security definitely would have been priority, as now you've got a new new asset that needs to be secure.
Right. Yeah, and in the area, and AP may not have to specifically deal with that, but some considerations of if a company has to be HIPAA compliant, maybe some private information, personal information is visible to AP people. When you're at home, who can visually see your screen? Because that may be in violation of some HIPAA laws if they have personal information on their screen and somebody can see it. If you're sitting in a coffee shop, that may be a violation of HIPAA laws. And so this new situation we're in is just different, and it requires a different set of rules, a different set of training, and we're all just trying to be as safe and secure as possible.
Okay. Well, that was absolutely great, and I know that you're busy with your studies, but do you finish your PhD? Expecting to finish it this year?
It's January 2021, and I expect to get my PhD in December 2021. So that's the goal. So I just recently had 2 papers published. It was I mentioned the Anti-Phishing Working Group. They have a yearly conference, the eCrime, where they focus on electronic crime. And so I had 2 papers published there and presented in November. That was supposed to be in Boston, so it was all virtual, but videos of those will be coming out. So I have 2, yay, that was fun, the academic papers. So yeah.
So if the listeners want to connect with you, or maybe, find out where they can view those papers, where would they go?
Sure. Right now, I don't have them online, but my personal website is geoffreysimpson.me, and that's Geoffrey with a G. And then I have Spiked Mace Software, and also breach.management, which is a cybersecurity focused company. So any of those places, I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn, so this is probably the best place to find me.
So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 117th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.